Welcome to today's webinar, Plan, Execute, and Measure Your Way to Product Success. My name is Andre Theus, and I will be your moderator today. Today's webinar is brought to you by The Product Stack, a coalition of product managers focused on helping you build customer-centric products through successful product planning, more efficient sprint execution, and clearer insight into your product metrics. I'm really excited to announce our three featured speakers for today. First, we have Jim Samick talk about planning and prioritizing. Jim is one of the founders of Product Plan. Over the course of the last 15 years, Jim has validated and launched several new products, including AppFolio, GoToMyPC, and GoToMeeting. Our second speaker is Dan Posetli from Pivotal Labs. Dan is the general manager of Pivotal Tracker, the popular project collaboration tool for software teams. Dan has experience in every aspect of software development, including engineering, product management, and UX design. Last but not least, we have Dave Shanley, and Dave is from Notion. Dave is an experienced founder that has taken products from concept to global adoption. Dave started Notion to specifically address the challenges he experienced in scaling product teams in growing organizations. And Dave is jumping in here last minute for his co-founder, Kevin Steigerwald. Kevin could not join us today as communicated because he was selected for jury duty. Thanks so much, Dave, for jumping in. And one reminder, please, that's the beauty of live webinars, please ask questions throughout the entire webinar. We have people online that will answer your question, and we go through the questions and we will pick the top questions and we will try to address as many questions at the end of this webinar. Before I hand it over to our first speaker, Jim, I'd like to better understand who's joining us today. Let me launch our first poll. Can everybody see the poll? Okay. So please select one of the following. If you're in product or management, select the first one. If you're in marketing or sales, the second one, and so on. Let me wait a little bit until we have a lot of attendees submitted their votes. Let me give this a few more seconds so everybody had a chance to select an answer. Okay, let me close the poll and share the results. Right on. Looks like the vast majority, probably not surprisingly, is in product or project management. Thanks so much for answering this first poll. There will be more polls coming throughout the webinar. So without further ado, I wanted to hand it over to our first speaker, Jim Samick.
Great. Thanks so much, Andre. I'm really excited to be here. I think that talking about all aspects of development, whether you're planning or executing or measuring what you're doing, is really important. And so I'm excited to talk about planning as part of that. And I want to first start by taking a step back and talking about what we mean by planning and prioritization. But before we do that, let's launch another poll. I'm really curious because it showed that 65% of you are in product or project management. I'm curious what roadmap prioritization challenges you have. So if you take a second here and answer this question, I'm really curious about some of the challenges that you're seeing when you're planning what you'll be building. So we'll give that another few seconds here. Looks like a few of you are still voting. Okay, great. All right, these are interesting results and not that uncommon. I think most of us have been part of organizations where the executives are driving the priorities and rather than customers or rather than other stakeholders. And we often see that, especially executives that are particularly loud, and I think we've all worked in organizations like that. And so The priorities are often ever changing. The priorities are often unclear. That's a very common thing that we hear from our customers as well. And as well, too much subjectivity in the prioritization process. So we're going to touch in the next few minutes on all of these challenges. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of top-down strategic planning. So for a lot of us, we think about prioritization and what we're going to be building in terms of the backlog. But I'd like to take a step back and talk about top-down strategic planning, which is this more of a long-term approach to planning what it is that you'll be building. So this image here comes from a book that we wrote on the topic. And so if you're interested in hearing more about what I'm talking about, we have a book on the topic. It's at productplan.com/book. And it's about planning, prioritization, and road mapping. But for strategic planning, it usually starts with product vision. This product vision is often set by the founders of the company or by the executive team. And this product vision is often a long-term vision of where you want to take the product. And long-term meaning potentially years. And your product today may not meet that vision, but you want to drive towards that vision. Now, for the goals of the product, that's derived from the product vision. And the goals are really more short-term. And by short-term, I mean potentially a year. So from that product vision, which for perhaps Google, it might be the ultimate way, for Google search, it might be the ultimate way of searching everything that's on the web. Well, you have certain product goals that you want to achieve over a few months or a year or so. And those goals might be driven by the KPIs that you have for your organization. It might be driven by the strategic goals that you have within the organization. And those can be driven by the executive team and the founders. And from those goals and those KPIs, those metrics that you want to shoot for, you derive the product roadmap. And I'll talk about that process a little bit too. Now, finally, from that product roadmap, you're deriving your backlog and the release plan. So these are very specific. The backlog and the release plan are very specific ways of executing on that product roadmap. So let's talk a little bit about the strategy versus the execution. So Dan from Tracker will be talking a little bit more about the backlog and how the execution of that roadmap occurs. But the way that I think about the roadmap is that it's usually big initiatives, big themes that you're shooting for based on those product goals, based on those KPIs. And then from that, you might be deriving epics that you're building. And I think most of you, from what I've seen from our customers and from others, most of you are operating in an agile environment. And probably the bulk of you are operating in a Scrum environment. And so I think hopefully that term epics makes sense to you. Now, the backlog, on the other hand, is the execution of that vision, the execution of that roadmap. And so the backlog, you're thinking about epics, more detailed stories, tasks, bugs, that sort of thing. So it becomes much more granular. And so the benefits of having a strategic roadmap is that, one, it defines the vision and the strategy of where you're headed. So I'll review what a strategic roadmap could look like for you. It also guides the execution of that strategy. So the people that are executing the strategy, meaning the engineers or the other teams involved with developing the product, it helps guide their execution. It gives them the big picture about why they're developing what they're developing. And it also, a strategic roadmap aligns your internal stakeholders. So these are all key problems that a lot of organizations experience. And I think that, the poll that we just ran about the executives driving the priority or too much subjectivity around the prioritization, that's in part a problem because the executive team is not in alignment about what they're trying to do. And so if you have a strategic roadmap, a roadmap that's designed around the long-term vision and the goals for the product, you're less likely to encounter that issue where the priorities are driven by the executives and those priorities are constantly changing. And so this next point that I want to make about facilitating the discussion of the options and scenarios. This is a really important piece of product management. So for those of you that are responsible for communicating the strategy, for communicating and building the roadmap, this is really essential. Your job is to act as a facilitator, to act as a communicator of the roadmap, and to facilitate those discussions that happen around the roadmap. So, you know, the good product managers that I've worked with, I've learned a lot from them. And one of the key things that I've learned is to have that continual discussion with the executive team about the possible scenarios and provide transparency into the thought process around why it is that you're doing what you're doing. So part of that is to communicate the progress of development, which I think a lot of people do. But before that, you are having a discussion around all of the options and the scenarios so that you are being transparent about why it is that you're doing it. So, and that, again, as I mentioned earlier, comes from having defined what the strategic initiatives are, what the goals are for the product. Okay, so part of the discussion that you're having is around prioritization. So let's talk for a minute around prioritization. And let's talk about the differences in prioritizing the backlog and the roadmap. So this is a common question that comes up when we're engaging with customers. First of all, I want to touch on something that I just mentioned, which is that it's really important to be transparent with your stakeholders about how you're prioritizing the initiatives for the roadmap or the backlog. Okay, so I think this is a really important thing to get them involved in that thought process, rather than running off to a dark room somewhere and then coming out a few weeks later with this is what we're going to be developing. It's important to involve the stakeholders in that thought process, if not directly involving them with the actual prioritization process. And I'll explain a couple of techniques for you to use, but also involving them with how you arrived at what you're arriving at. And the prioritization process is not just about getting your stakeholders around a table. Of course, you need to have customer input. You need to have good product management sense about where the market is taking you. You need to really understand the competitors. You really need to understand the business goals that you're shooting for. And of course, you have stakeholder needs. So when I'm talking about prioritization, this is not something that's being done in a black box. It's really being done with a lot of different factors with your stakeholders so they understand what's happening. So I want to talk about prioritizing the roadmap versus backlog here. So on the screen here, you can see that I've divided this into roadmap prioritization and backlog prioritization. And these are not the same thing. A lot of people, especially people that are newer to product management, think about the roadmap as the backlog. And that's not the case. The backlog, as I mentioned, is the execution of that roadmap. And the way that you prioritize those two areas is very different. So with the roadmap, you think you know where you want to take the product, but you don't know what the specifics are yet. These items might be really fuzzy. Versus the backlog, where you already know that you're going to be building something. In the backlog, you have probably a handful of sprints that you're planning for ahead of time. That may be 4 weeks or maybe even 6 weeks out that you're planning. You don't know exactly what the details are, but you know you're going to be developing something. So that's one key difference between the prioritizing the roadmap versus the backlog. And with the backlog, because you already know what it is that you're going to be developing, you typically know some details around it. You know the features, and you know at least the stories that you're going to be writing, or many of the stories, or at least at the epic level, you know what you're going to be developing. But you don't know the development order. So you don't know, for example, how you're going to be breaking up a particular feature into releases, for example. Or you don't know whether something is going to be MVP for your products. You might be writing stories, and you might have some nice-to-haves in there. But you don't know for certain what the development order is going to be or where you're going to draw the line. But you do know that you're going to be developing that feature. So therefore, the prioritization methods that you use are very different between the roadmap and the backlog. With the roadmap, you're pulling in all sorts of market information, customer value information, competitive information. You do want development effort to be part of that thought process, but that development effort isn't at the story or at the story point level. That estimate of development effort on the roadmap is really at that thumb in the air, t-shirt sizing level. Is this big, medium, or small? And that's enough information often to be able to make prioritization decisions for the roadmap. Now, the backlog, however, is a narrower set of decision making. You already know that you're going to be building it, but in order to prioritize what's in your backlog, you want to be thinking about things such as customer value. So if we develop this particular enhancement or this particular area of a feature, what sort of customer value are we going to be seeing from it? You also want to be weighing very heavily estimates and story points. And of course, because this is executing on the roadmap, you want to be evaluating your available resources. So it's a much narrower set of decision making that you're going through when you're prioritizing the backlog versus the roadmap. Okay, good. So I do want to talk in the last couple of minutes here about a technique for prioritizing the roadmap. So we like to think about it on this sort of like a matrix, and you want to prioritize business value or customer value against the effort to implement something. And so in Product Plan, we have a framework for thinking through this. It's a weighted scoring model. But essentially what you're doing is you're plotting customer value or business value versus the effort or complexity to implement it. And this is a very common approach that a lot of product managers use. And whether you formalize this through some sort of a scoring framework, or you simply think through it as part of your decision-making process, the way that you go about it is essentially the same. And the way it works is that you want to be prioritizing the items and implementing the items that are low-hanging fruit, which have high value and low effort. So if that I think that makes sense to most of you, hopefully. So high value and low effort, this is a no-brainer. We should be doing this. Now, there are items on the lower left of the quadrant that are high effort or really high complexity or high risk and low value. And these are things that you will never do. In any product, there's simply too many opportunities. And so you want to be able to take a lot of things off the table that are hard to implement and don't provide that high customer value. Then the question marks are those items that have high customer value but are hard to implement, and I would encourage you to include a few of those on your roadmap. So these are the items in the upper right portion of the quadrant. If you were to simply implement just the easy wins for your product, you're going to wind up with a product probably that is not as compelling. And so I would encourage you to implement some of those harder to implement and high customer value items, because those are the items that are potentially going to make your product differentiated in the market. Okay, those are the things that are going to give you customer delight. These are the things that maybe customers didn't even know they wanted, but because of that, you're offering them something that's significantly better than the competitors or differentiated in some way. And then the other items to consider, but probably not as highly, are the items that are really easy to implement and have lower customer value. So these might be smaller things, maybe usability improvements that you want to make in your app. But again, there are usually too many opportunities for you to implement, and so you want to maybe pick a few of those, but not spend all of your time just on the easy things, because those are not the things that are going to move the needle for you. And I do want to point out that when we're talking about customer value and business value, that is going to be different for every organization. The way that you think about the value that it provides to your customers is really based often on the metrics that you've defined as part of your product goals. So metrics such as customer satisfaction, or perhaps increasing revenue, or increasing a geographic market share. Those are the strategic goals that really tie back to the product and success in the product. And they also are the things that resonate with your stakeholders. And so you want to be positioning customer value or business value in those terms so that you can have those conversations, as I mentioned, with your stakeholders. And then finally, the way that you prioritize, and once you've made those decisions, it should get communicated back to the stakeholders visually. So the way that we think about a roadmap is that it's a way of tying those strategic goals, and in this example here, the strategic goals are color coding, back to the goals for the company. You want to be tying the roadmap back to those strategic goals. And so you want to be including, a description about what you're doing. You want to tie it in some way back to the strategy. You do want to show, if you can, customer evidence and different metrics of how you're going to be, of what implementing this particular item will do for your roadmap, and other details that support your vision. So I think those are some of the key elements of planning successfully and then being able to communicate the roadmap successfully. And just like the backlog, the roadmap, think about it as an agile tool for you. This roadmap should be constantly revisited, constantly reprioritized, and constantly discussed with your stakeholders. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Andre, and we'll have time for some questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Jim. Moving on to the next phase of the product stack. Once you have your plan and your priorities, it's crucial that you execute on them. And I will hand it over to Dan in order to give some advice on what best to do in that phase. Dan?
Thank you, Andre. Appreciate everybody being here. And Jim, great job talking about how we get to this point. And I have to say that you're part of it, the planning and actually getting everyone aligned so that there can be an actual roadmap that conveys priorities and provides a strategic direction for the product. That is the hard part. Execution, in my mind, that's easy, right? This is all about breaking things down into small little bite-sized pieces and making continued progress. So to get started talking about how we think about execution, we'd like to do a little bit of a poll or another poll. So Andre, if you could bring that up, great. So we want to know how often, right, you are shipping your product to your users, to your customers, to production, right? Whether that's, little bite-sized features or major new products, how often does that happen for you? So let's give that a minute or two. Okay, so we've got some numbers, and it's interesting. It seems that almost half of you are shipping something new every few weeks to months, and I think that is typical. Obviously, there's a lot of movement towards continuous delivery, right? Shipping all the time. Some of the larger products out there, like Facebook, they're known to have all the mechanisms in place to be able to ship continuously and get lots of feedback. So I think, in general, we want to be moving in that direction to ship smaller things more often, because that is the ultimate point of learning and validation, right? We do a lot of work to figure out what to build, what solutions. We design things, we get feedback, and we're always surprised when our solution, our product feature, hits the market, users actually start using it. That is when we learn, for real, and that's what really impacts our direction as a product and the path that we continue going down now. So thanks, Andre. Let's move back to the slides. Great. So let's start here. As we said, Jim gave us a way to get all that alignment and give ourselves a roadmap. This is extremely important. And from my experience, this really is the hardest thing to do, right? But let's assume that we've done so. We have a roadmap that takes us 6 to 9 months out. We've got buy-in, we have that clear path. So where do we go from there? How do we take this roadmap and actually break it down to something that we can build, right? So in my mind, this is all about decomposition, right? Everything we're doing at this point is decomposing. Now we don't, as Jim already mentioned, we don't take the entire roadmap and start breaking it down into small pieces. That would be extremely time-consuming, right? We'd have to get into a room, all of us as a team, break things down, do so for days. Then we'd have a lot of little cards or stickies or stories in Tracker we'd have a very long backlog, and chances are everything that's, that 4 to 6 week threshold and out is going to change, right? As you start building, as you start putting features in front of your customers and your users, you start learning a lot. A lot of the details come out, a lot of the assumptions that you may have made that may have not been correct start to get clarified, and things will change, right? So that right cadence in my mind is you have the roadmap that goes out to 6 to 9 months, and you plan your backlog on a continuous basis so that you've got a nice, crisp, broken down, shared to-do list for your team about 4 to 6 weeks out. Some teams do it a little bit longer out because they feel they learn a little bit more by decomposing a little bit further out. Some teams will do it more almost just in time, 1 week or 1 sprint at a time. I think it's, the cadence, what the right cadence is depends on the team, it depends on the situation, right? But there is that shorter term focus here. So there are a number of techniques for how to get from the sort of big problems, opportunities on the roadmap to stories in a backlog. A common technique is called story mapping, where you essentially decompose the big things into, you sort of group it by role, right? For each user role that you're trying to solve problems for, you decompose into activities. Those activities then end up being broken down into stories. And once you have that, you can do this on a whiteboard, you can do this with stickies on a big table. Once you've done that, right, the process of that uncovers a lot of assumptions, right? You get into some of the details, really good questions get answered, so it's good to do this as a team rather than, just you as a product manager with like maybe one other person, right? There's a lot of socialization that happens when you take the roadmap and start breaking it down. And people feel more connected into what's being built, why, etc. One of the things we want to do here is also identify our release milestones. And those may already be represented as milestones on your roadmap, and I think it's great to do that because it aligns people, it gets them to focus, right? You sort of hone in on the interesting points that you're trying to move towards, whether it's a big demo at a TechCrunch, Disrupt, or you actually releasing your MVP. These are important to the business, so you want to represent them. And then we want to consider those when breaking down these epics into our tactical backlog, because we want to be aware of those milestones at this level, right, to make sure that we're not planning too much scope. And as scope continues to increase continually, you want to make sure you can visualize impact on those milestones when scope increases so that you can have a constructive conversation about whether you should decrease scope in order to hit those milestones. So the final point here is once you've arranged your backlog with, and hopefully you've grouped these stories into epics, those epics represent those course of grain activities which may map one-to-one to roadmap items, or you may have a couple of epics that together make up a roadmap item on the roadmap. And so you want to connect them and update the roadmap on a regular basis, whether it's daily or weekly, so that the big picture always reflects what's actually happening on the ground at the tactical level, right? So everybody's connected, everybody understands what's happening, and the roadmap is a good way to visualize progress on a continuous basis. Similarly, release markers in your backlog can be mapped to the milestones on the roadmap so that you always know how far out you are from those milestones, and you know when scope increase impacts those milestones. If we could move to the next slide. Thanks, Andre. Okay, so this is the most basic thing that I think we do as product managers. In my mind, this is the unit of execution. This is where everything happens, right? We've been writing stories and talking about writing stories for a long time. This is nothing new. But breaking big problems into small incremental ones is actually pretty difficult and can be especially a challenge at the beginning of a project, right? Where do you start? What is that very first story? The goal is to get stories to be small so that we're not spending days and days or weeks on these stories, right? Because then it's like covering way too much. There's too much hiding in the scope of the story, too many assumptions, too many details. So we want to break it down to something that can be done in a matter of a couple of days or even less. Now, these stories aren't instructions to developers, right? They capture intent and they describe an incremental unit of progress in terms of your product and your product's evolution, right? So the story has a clear finish line. When the story is finished, you've now added some new value to your product, whether it's a little tiny feature or it's it's part of a feature that brings you closer, right? A feature might be something like, we want to enable emoji in our application, right? So enabling emoji in our application might be the epic. It might be the item on the roadmap, but that needs to break down to small pieces, right? For example, being able to copy and paste an emoji character into your story description, if your product is Tracker, which is ours. Each of these shouldn't take longer than a couple of days. They should span the entire sort of all the layers, meaning that we're not writing a story to make a change in the database first, and then writing another story to actually consume that ability now in the UI. We have a thin slice that goes top to bottom, right? So we can touch all the layers. When we're done, the feature worked. And another kind of interesting thing here is if we take that approach with stories to make them vertical slices, it means that we can actually ship our product anytime after every story, right? Because the system works. There's nothing broken. There's nothing strange where if you click that button, it blows up because the next story was going to be to make it not blow up and actually do something when you hit the button, right? One button at a time, one piece of functionality. It means we can ship anytime. And it becomes a business decision or a product decision as to whether we actually do roll that out because we want a more holistic new experience for our users that'll delight them more. But the granularity of the stories is such that we could ship anytime. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have our backlog. It's made up of these nice, fine-grained, incremental, verifiable stories. We feel good about that. Now, how do we actually start picking these up? How do we actually start building our software based on that backlog? So these days, most products are built by teams, right? Rather than just an individual developer. If you're building something really small where you're just engaged with one developer, that's probably pretty easy, right? You have one developer, that's a team, they just pick the next story out of the backlog and go, and you just wait for them to deliver those stories so you can accept them. But typically, you have a group of people working together to build something. And so we at Pivotal really, really believe in the power of small cross-functional teams that practice collective ownership. And that's what Tracker was sort of built to support. It means that we are a team, and a team, by the way, is not 30, 40 people. It's not all these people that happen to be in the same building working for the same company, right? They're not necessarily a team. A team is that which operates as a unit. It has one set of priorities, that has a clear mission, and we're working together rather than passing work from one individual to another, from one role to another, from one department to another, right? We are literally sitting together. We have that one backlog. That one backlog is our collectively owned shared to-do list that represents exactly where we need to go, one step at a time. And so having the milestones be visible at the tactical level is important because it aligns us, right? So we need those release markers. We need that roadmap to tell us where we're going. And we're collaborating. Software is not done best when we sort of adopt an assembly line model, meaning that you sort of visualize or represent a workflow where something starts over here and then it gets sort of moved to a certain stage, then it gets moved to the next node of assembly, right? It doesn't work like that. There's too much communication that has to happen throughout. So we want to work as a team, right? We don't assign tasks, we pull from that list. And we want to embrace the long haul here, right? Most software products these days don't just get built in 3 months and then they're done and you have great success as a business, right? The first launch point is usually just the first time you really learn about what your product needs to be and what it shouldn't be, right? And so you're going to continue to iterate. Every milestone is an opportunity for another milestone, right? You got to keep going. The world keeps changing. So you have to embrace sustainability, consistency. Consistency gives you predictability or better predictability about what the future will bring. If you have been acting in a consistent manner, right? Every week you get about the same amount of work done. Now that tells you how much longer it'll take to complete the rest of the backlog, etc. So one more slide, and hopefully we'll be done with that. Sorry, 1 second. Thank you. Okay, so we have our team, and as we said, a team has to be the right size, right? 30 people aren't necessarily acting as a team. It's difficult to work out of one backlog. There's too much communication, right? You start to not even know everybody else's name. You can't operate as a unified single unit on a mission. So what's the right team size? It probably depends on the situation. At Pivotal, or in our experience, an ideal team is a product manager, a designer, or a UX person, and 2 to 3 pairs of engineers, which translates to 4 to 6 engineers because we pair. So that 8-person, 8, 9, 10-person team is ideal, right? It can work out of one backlog. It can have singular focus. Obviously, as things grow, you start to get more people. You go beyond that number. You're no longer operating in teams, so you have to split. Most products go through that threshold of having to grow to multiple. And it's always a common question. It's a common question as to how you organize when you're working on the same product as multiple teams, right? And there's different ways to do that. One approach that's typical is to organize around horizontal architecture layers, right? So you have like a back-end team or a platform team. You have a front-end team, a web front-end team. You have an iOS team, which is natural. It does lead to strong ownership of parts of the application or code base, right? So people get to be really good at that particular area of the system, with the appropriate set of skills. However, you build silos, and every customer or product problem or opportunity now has to span multiple teams, multiple PMs, multiple layers of communication. There's always disagreement. Now you're doing all this work trying to align the backend team and the front-end team. The backend team may have built an API for that feature that the front-end team was going to consume, but they got busy. They didn't provide immediate feedback on whether it was built the right way. They move on, they do something else. Then they come back. They start consuming those endpoints. Oops, we made the wrong assumptions. Got to go back. We have to figure out how we're going to reconnect it. Just a lot of communication overhead, right? So the best way, in my mind, to organize teams is around vertical initiatives, so that a given team, one PM with their team, can take a problem off the roadmap and go all the way to solving the problem, shipping the solution to the customers, learning from it without constraint, without a lot of dependencies, without having to coordinate everything with all the other teams, right? So vertical teams organized around initiatives or customer experiences, or if you happen to be building something that's made up of a bunch of microservices, which is a really ideal way to do it if you can start that way, where you have highly decoupled independent services that make up the product, then it's really nice to align teams to those services, right? Full ownership, full control, the power to solve the problem, go all the way. And of course, once you have multiple teams working together, communication across those teams becomes paramount. And this is where strong product management, PMs talking to each other every day, all the time, having weekly sync meetings, and having that common vision represented as a shared roadmap is critical, right? So I can't stress enough the importance of that roadmap to keep multiple teams aligned and going in the same direction. And just finally, you're probably familiar with Conway's Law. It basically says that the system or the product that you produce, right, will sort of mirror how you've organized your communication structure in your sort of people organization, right? So if you isolate and silo people, you will end up with strange silos in your product, and your customers will notice, right? So it sort of just reinforces the importance of being vertical and being able to solve the problem, the entire problem, right, beginning to end, for great success. And I will end on that note.
Thanks so much, Dan. Great advice. Moving on to the third phase of the product stack. Last but not least, Dave will share some advice around measuring. Dave, please take it away.
Thanks, Andre. So we'll kick things off with a poll here. What area is your company most focused when it comes to tracking data? So we think about this in a lot of different ways, but I want to hear what you're focused on right now. Great, I think people are weighing in here. And awesome. So we've got a spread across acquisition, getting new customers, building awareness, activation, getting them engaged, retention, and then referral, revenue, focused on the later stages, and looks like a strong concerns around team performance. So Jim touched on the different strategic levels of Andre. Could you go move off the poll? So Jim touched on the different strategic levels that you need as input to your product plan, your framework, and Dan broke it down into that execution level, that execution layer where you're breaking down those tasks, and it's really, really hard. I mean, I think the secret here is we have, as product managers, we have the best job. Marketing gets to have input and they have to deal with output, but they don't get to actually build the product. Sales is meeting the market, but they don't actually get to build the product. They don't get to drive the future forward as much as we do as product managers. And so we have a lot of responsibility, but what I heard earlier is it's the unclear priorities and the execs potentially changing up what those priorities are on a frequent basis are really difficult and really challenging at that strategic level. And so I want to make your job easier by helping you build out decision frameworks. It's those real frameworks are the lens that you're going to look at to make those decisions easier. And if you're using a framework like we have listed here, we think of things in this ART framework. It's based on the pirate metrics and adding team into the mix at each stage. It's what phase are you as a company, as an organization, and as a team? Are you in that exploration phase? We saw a lot of people mention that. They are, search for product market fit, early product adoption phase, seeking out customers. How do you meet the market? How do you build a market for that? That's a whole different set of measures. Like what you're going to explore and what you're going to measure and what matters to you is completely different than if you're at the expansion phase. So now we've got a customer base and we're growing and it's really exciting, but it's like hang on, and we're measuring something else. And then at the later phases, the extraction phase, we've grown and it's about optimizing. And what are we going to focus on at that point? And how do we know what we're doing is working? And how do we know that we're improving at each point? That's really the questions we need to ask ourselves, and it's really difficult. In scaling my last company, we ended up almost adrift on a product management side, and we looked around and we said, hey, what's our number one goal? And it was a very sales-driven organization, and the people around the table said, revenue. If we're number one when we make the most money, but that's a really simplistic way of viewing it. And so what we really adopted was, okay, if we're in that referral and revenue stage, how can we break that down? How can we break that down into actionable metrics? Metrics that are meaningful, right? They align with our business goals. They are measurable. We can get a handle on them, and we're going to talk a little bit about balancing those. And they have an owner. Ownership is really, really critical. And I think what you're hearing from Jim and Dan as part of this is that, a lot of people think that the product management or engineering management role is all about being technical. It's really actually about communication. How are you communicating out to those other stakeholders so that you can wrangle, you can wrestle your roadmap back, so that you have control over your destiny, so you can provide to marketing and sales, what they want, but distill down into what the right values are for you right now. On the acquisition side, it's thinking about how many leads are coming in, how are you onboarding customers, right, to that initial engagement phase. At the activation point, it's product usage metrics, and do you have clear visibility on that? And being able to sell that back into the organization that we're focused on these set of metrics, getting buy-in up front. Even at that strategic level, it's at a higher level. It's when we were struggling as a growing product team, we focused on, hey, we're going to split up our activities, the inputs to our product roadmap from a pure innovation standpoint. we're going to allocate essentially this much time to really, new innovative features that we hadn't done before. We're going to allocate a percentage of time to baseline feature improvements, and we're going to allocate a time to tech debt. And so that was, the lens at which we looked through, that matching that up to our phase of our organization, that mapped onto, revenue and referral metrics that you can see here. And then another framework that's worth exploring is Google's Heart framework. Much more UX centered, but it's still now taking it down from the strategic level to the tactical level, mapping happiness, engagement, adoption, retention, task success, where those are down at individual feature level, and you're setting goals and looking for signals and measures from those. Very, very important to set and align those goals across the organization. But even if you have, unclear priorities and shifting executive input, you can still be clear with your goals at the feature level and the levels that you can control. One thing that we do here at Notion, we're focused on documenting as we go and making sure we use Product Plan, we use Pivotal Tracker, and we set out success criteria for each individual thing that we're doing. We have clear goals around why we're working on this. We're at the acquisition activation phase, and then from the output of that and going into a more tactical execution level, we want to see engagement around the specific things that we're shipping. So post deployment, what percentage of users are activating around this in the specific usage of this feature? Is there customer satisfaction, net promoter scores mapping into that happiness, and then internal team polling to see that did we deliver customer value, did we deliver customer success? And the challenge that you have is packaging that all up in a really, really easy way to then present that back to the stakeholders and say, yes, we did deliver on what we laid out. We all agreed on this framework at a top strategic level. Then we executed at this, much more tactical level. We measured this. We had these outcomes, and making it really, really dead simple to make your case. Next slide. So that really brings us to a common place to have that conversation. So if the main job, the main challenge that we have as product management, as engineering leadership is communication, how do we effectively do that? It's really about getting that information into one place. I think a lot of teams struggle with goal setting, with stepping back, because suddenly it turns into this huge conversation, and there's a lot of disagreement or a lack of clarity, and they don't know how to get started, or it's simply, it seems like almost a waterfall approach to that they have to define all of the things up front before they can track anything. Before we get down to success around feature X, we have to blow this up and define every single goal, and we have to measure every single thing that's in the system. And we would say, like, hey, pause on that a little bit, focus on what's immediately important, what you can control right now, what's going to move the needle. All of us have a sense of what that is. I think it's really just key that we articulate that and can build that case back, right? And if you can sell that up the chain, that's the most perfect way to start. But if you can start those conversations small with your team, we see a lot of success with that. But it's really about, how do you take an iterative approach to measurement? How do you, dive in, and if it's at that, referral or revenue stage, like what specific metrics are, indicate that success there? So it could be, the virality of your product, right? So you're measuring how many invites are occurring in your system relative to the number of users that you're signing up, and tracking that rate as a percentage. That's a very, very small amount of information to get there, and you probably have that information already, but it's not in a central place. It's not in a place where, like, with one click of a button, you can broadcast that out to your team. And it's not just about the data either. It's about the conversation that's happening around that data. It's, numbers are fantastic. Numbers will definitely change the conversation. You go into your next meeting and you're fully prepared to, present on the trends and how that specific feature adoption is tracking. That immediately changes the conversation. It's, it makes your job easier, it makes your life easier, it keeps everything on focus, but it is also capturing that conversation and that dialogue that's happening around that that really closes the loop. And finally, next slide. Don't let your data lie, right? Use this new superpower of measuring both at at that tactical level and at the strategic level. Make sure that you're putting together and having the conversation at the right level. So when you think about that, think about counter metrics. It's not simply, how many, what's the referral rate, but you're also tracking what the lifetime value of those customers are. So you're balancing out what can possibly undermine this piece of the conversation that we're having, what can undermine these metrics and what they're showing, and making sure that you are rounding out and tracking that. And so, signups versus subscriptions, velocity, versus the team polling and like team happiness. You might be moving very, very quickly through things, but if the team is actually unhappy, then you have a problem, and that's a whole other conversation. But being able to track and trend those is really, really key to having the conversation at the right level, and will make your life dramatically easier as you go and tell your story to your own team to get them aligned with what you want to have as a successful outcome, and then going up to management and having that conversation at that right level, and driving and connecting, closing the loop on the strategic vision that you set out for your product. So we can move on to questions, because I know a lot of you had some really fantastic questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dave. This was great. And we're getting close to the hour, and we got lots and lots of questions. Thank you to everyone submitting the questions. I feel like the question portion is the most fun part of a live webinar. And we'll try to address a few questions, but I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So let's see what questions we got. The first one is from Laura, and Jim, why don't you answer this one? The question is, how do I prioritize feedback that I get from customers? Do you have any best practices?
Oh, that's a good one. As product managers, we're used to this influx of information and questions and feature requests from customers, and it's easy to get completely overwhelmed by that. I think a lot of novice product managers start off by keeping lists of all of the feature requests that they get from customers, and at some point you realize that that's pretty fruitless, because one, there's just no possible way to implement all of this, and two, a lot of the questions and feedback requests, feature requests that you get from customers may not be the right thing to build. And so, I think that the sophisticated and experienced product managers are used to not just simply keeping a rote list of features that you get from customers and then doing the ones that have the highest number of requests. What you need to be doing is thinking through why someone wants that feature to begin with. What is the problem that they're going to be solving? And then, how does that tie back to the strategic goals for your product? And of course, we want to be having a large proportion of our thought process and delivery of product around delivering high customer value, around creating delight for our customers. And so you want to have a very customer-focused viewpoint, but that doesn't mean implementing the exact things that people ask for. The last company where I worked, we had feature requests for different buttons and different reports, and by thinking through what they wanted to accomplish, we were able to deliver features that were quite a bit different than customers requested, but still delivered it to them in a better way than they had originally asked for. So we've all heard the quotes about customers not really knowing what they want, and so from a product management standpoint, it's important to prioritize based on the value that it gives to your customers. Okay, and also I mentioned business value, which is a really important part of this. You know, you want to be delivering things that move the needle for the company as well. And a lot of that is rooted in what makes customers successful, but you still want to be thinking about the business metrics as well. And offsetting that with the amount of complexity it takes to develop something. So that's kind of that matrix that I talked about, and it works really well for feedback requests. And if you can kind of bucket these feedback requests into the feature requests into buckets of strategic goals that you have. If you have, for example, 4 strategic goals for the year, putting those into themes and buckets is a really useful way of kind of excluding a lot of the noise that you're going to be hearing from customers. And so there are a couple of ways of prioritizing, and we actually have some articles on our blog and plenty of other great articles of ways of prioritizing that you can look into.
Thanks so much, Jim. In order to get through as many questions in little time, let's try to answer the question briefly, and let me address one question to each of you guys. So the next question came in from Dimitri, and Dave, why don't you answer this one? I think that's a good one for you. Does measurement guarantee product success? Asked Dimitri, and he's wondering, can you rely on measurement and planning only for success?
Hey, Dimitri. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. You know, measurement alone doesn't define product success, but you know, just like a destination, you don't know that you're there until you actually can observe that you are. And so it's really, really critical piece to the product process that I think a lot of people struggle with because it can be hard, and a lot of teams fall into trying to define all the things up front when they can take a much more agile, iterative approach to what they're tracking, and again, align it with that strategic and tactical focus.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dave. The next one is for Dan, and the question is from Lucas. And Dan, Lucas is asking, are deadlines a thing of the past? And if not, how do they fit into the product development cycle, and how do you enforce them?
It's a great question. Thanks, Lucas. And it's funny, in the Agile community, there's this, I guess, perception that deadlines are like a taboo subject. We cannot talk about dates. We just prioritize and we just do the right thing incrementally, right? Which, you know, if you have the luxury of not caring about dates at all, then that's great, right? You just prioritize and you do stuff and you make decisions around, you know, features and feedback, etc. But the reality is that dates do matter in most situations, right? And I think the best way to represent deadlines or target dates or whatever the ideal dates are, especially those that are aligned with some kind of a real-world event that you cannot change, right? Going back to my previous example of, you know, you've got invited to present at TechCrunch Disrupt. That is happening on a certain day. You have to show something. You have to show some working software, right? There is a date. What do you do? And I think this is one of the things that a product manager should be, you know, that's one of the dimensions to consider. On the roadmap, you want to represent demo at Disrupt on a certain date, and then you try and prioritize the things that you want to achieve by then. As that date gets closer, and as you also represent that deadline in Tracker, let's say, with a release marker, as you're getting closer and closer to it, the closer you get, the better sense you get as to whether you'll be able to hit that deadline. And scope keeps increasing, right? So what do? You can choose between moving the deadline, if you can, or you choose reducing scope. I mean, those are the only two possible answers to managing deadlines. So I think it's, you know, keeping the date very visible as a shared milestone, and then constantly managing scope as you're moving towards it to make sure that, you know, the right balance of the two ends up occurring by the time that the date hits.
Thanks, Dan. Let's try to do one more question for each of you, and I appreciate that so many of you are staying with us here. The next one, Jim, why don't you answer this one? This is from Rahish. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. The question is, how to convert a strategy document or report into an action roadmap? Oh,
that's a good one, Rajesh. A lot of us build business cases as product managers, and I'm assuming that's what you mean by a strategy document. And I think that's a great question. My suggestion to you is to look for the common themes in that strategic document. And there should be one, goals, right? Why are we doing this in the first place? That's a great place to start with the themes. And then kind of bucket the things that you see that have commonality together. And from that, you might be able to pull out certain themes, and then you can translate those into features or themes that belong on your product roadmap. And and of course, if this strategic document doesn't have the why behind what you're doing in the first place, then you probably need to revisit that document. But I would start first with the goals. And you don't want to have too many goals as part of this document. The goals, maybe 4 or so goals that you want to be shooting for. And those goals should be metrics driven, right? How do we measure success? If we do this, then how do we know that we're successful? So you want to start there, and then you want to be able to group, within this report, I'm assuming there are, there's a description of what the product's going to be and what it's going to accomplish. You want to start to be able to, group these together into themes, and then those are what go onto the roadmap.
Thanks, Jim. Let's see, the next one here, Dave, why don't you answer this one? This question is from Sumit. Sumit is wondering, how do you take time out from executing the sprint to track metrics religiously?
Yeah, and that's it's always a challenge. We have constrained resources in people and time. The best thing is to go with tracking that doesn't have a lot of technical overhead, right? We find that it's a brutal choice to have to, choose between delivering customer value and trying to get our internal systems and operations up to speed. So, one, I would recommend pick something that you can own as that product manager and all the leads on your teams can own without technical resources, and then start small, right? Make sure that you're tracking the really, really key things. Make sure that you're backing that up with counter metrics so that you have a well-rounded view of achieving success, and that it's not single focus and isn't skewing the results. And then, yeah, that's where I would start. Start small and make sure that you are really using something that you can own and maintain and that the team can leverage.
Thanks, Dave. This is our last question. Thanks again for staying longer. We very much appreciate that. Dan, this is a question for you from Claire. And Claire is wondering, how do you build continuous teams in an environment where every epic requires integration and collaboration on different platforms?
Claire, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. This is a typical problem in larger organizations where you don't have the luxury of just starting a new product from scratch, putting a team together, going all the way, shipping some features, and getting great feedback from your customers. You are in a world where things have to work together. It's not always easy, right? The ideal is to put together a team that is cross-functional enough where all the platforms, all the integration points that need to work together or need to be interacted with or consumed, there is somebody from those. So instead of there being a platform team on the other side of the building that you have to constantly ask and beg to give you some endpoints or platform changes, you bring a person or some people from the platform team, make them part of this product team, this cross-functional team, so that you can actually make changes to the platform in line with what you're trying to solve or what you're trying to build, right? So the ideal, and we've seen a lot of success in larger companies that Pivotal has worked with, where they're really trying this and they are breaking up traditional ways of organizing and keeping departments and platforms separate. They bring them together. They form these teams that touch everything that needs to be touched to solve the problem. Short of that, I think you have to find a way to isolate and allow the team to make progress, even though they don't necessarily have the dependencies that they need. And you simulate those dependencies. And as a product manager, you work really hard to make sure that those other PMs of those other teams are providing what you need, so that you have some runway and you can execute.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks so much for all the questions that came in. We got well over 100 questions. I apologize that we were not able to answer all the questions, but we very much appreciate the active participation. And this concludes today's webinar. Dan, Dave, and Jim, thank you so much for sharing your valuable advice. I hope everybody took some piece of advice and can implement that. I would also encourage everybody to continue the conversation. All of us are on our public Slack account. You can join the public Slack account by going to theproductstack.com, and it's free to join. And our next Product Stack event will be next month in Denver. If you're in the Denver area, I would encourage you to come by. More infos will follow. And everybody who registered will get a recording of this webinar via email tomorrow. The recording will be online in less than 24 hours. And then last but not least, I encourage everybody to sign up for a free trial. You have a free product plan trial. There's a free trial for Pivotal Tracker as well as Notion. I would encourage everybody to sign up and check it out if you haven't checked out the products yet. Thanks again for joining us today. I hope it was a great webinar. Bye.